Welcome back to Family Twist. If you listened to part one of this conversation, you already know Peter's story is unlike anything we've shared before. And if you haven't listened yet, we urge you to go back and listen to that now because this might not make sense. At 59 years old, a casual DNA test revealed Peter had been adopted, a fact no one had ever told him. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his identity, it was all built on a lie. In part two, Peter doesn't just tell us what he learned, he shows us what he did with the truth. After discovering his birth father's identity, Peter fought to have his father's name added to his original birth certificate. The government said no. They demanded DNA evidence that was impossible to provide because his father had passed away decades earlier. But Peter didn't back down. What followed was a 6-year legal battle against a system that erases, redacts, and forgets adoptees. And in the end, Peter won. This isn't just about one name on a document, it's about refusing to be invisible. It's about every person who's ever been told that their truth doesn't matter. And at the end of this episode, you'll hear something incredibly special, a song created by Peter with the help of AI. It's called Mio Padre, My Father, a tribute to the man he never got to meet but will never stop honoring. Here's part two of Peter's story.
People talk about the fog, and they say, well, I was pushed out of the fog, like thrust out of the fog. And, and I was on the peripheral of that, I guess, if you look at it that way. I still had a lot of unpacking to do, but the urgency was set. But you got a choice about that.
Mm-hmm. Right. What would you say are some of the top wins, accomplishments, and the top challenges that are facing the organization?
Getting it started in the first place, I think, was a big win. I believe they'd had a number of false starts. Whenever you're working with adoptees, there's a lot of raw emotions and personalities and conflict. So you're always navigating through that drama. They had a few false starts, and it's not always an easy road. We've had a few bumps along the way. So keeping things together, it's like any organisation. It doesn't matter how many numbers you have. It's always a few doing all the work and trying to get people, not just for volunteer, but actually volunteer and commit and do. It doesn't matter how many numbers you have. It's always a few doing all the work and trying to get people, not just for volunteer, but actually volunteer and commit and do something. And I'm the world's biggest procrastinator, so I don't point the finger at anyone in particular without pointing the finger to myself first. But yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges. We do a lot of submissions to inquiries. There's been a number of inquiries over here. The problem with inquiries is they bring out all this stuff and it's all the same, and then they get parked on the shelf. They have recommendations, and maybe one or two recommendations actually come to fruition. The other 20 get left on the shelf, and that's frustrating. I've had a few personal wins, which I think's been good for the organisation, and I've had one significant personal win, I should say, that 2 years ago I won a court case against the New South Wales birth, deaths and marriages. I've been trying to get my father's name on my original birth certificate, which probably 97 or 98% of adoptees don't have the father's name on the birth certificate. That was done as a policy. They didn't want the father's name on there when they were trafficking you to the adoption system. There was a fear that the fathers would object, which they had every right to do, and stop the process. So their rights were denied as well. The father's rights were denied, as well as mother's rights. And, of course, the adoptee's rights, the child's rights were... And we're looking at this as a human rights issue now. That's really what it is. But anyway, my father's name wasn't on my birth certificate. And, I guess that was one of my biggest things, the fact that I had two birth certificates. I couldn't get over that. I'd relied on this birth certificate my whole life. And to find out that it was fabricated, not only was there distrust in my parents that they'd lied to me, but the state had lied to me. And I made a decision very early on that I wasn't going to blame the adopters per se. My anger wouldn't be directed to them. The anger would be directed to the government, and my mission was very clearly that this should never happen to another child ever again. And that remains the same. I applied through my mother's application, which under the Act, the Birth, Deaths and Marriages Act, she was entitled to put my father on there, and in his absence, if he could not be found or he was deceased, but they just refused to do it. Mm-hmm. And then they said, look, I went and put her application in again, and by this stage, I was talking to the assistant registrar for birth, deaths and marriages, and they said, look, we want you to put the application in under your own name. We've produced a form for you, and we want you to be the first one to do that, but I was bound to secrecy. I wasn't allowed to share it because it hadn't been put out to the public yet, and they asked me for all my input and changes on it. I went, oh, okay, this is all looking good. So I applied, and I was the first one to apply and the first one to get rejected.
Oh.
And then a new registrar came along, and I put in obviously an appeal, and he said, look, I'll personally look at it, and we had a good relationship, and he reviewed it, and he rejected it. And to his credit, he said I should go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And I said, why? So they can rubber stamp what you've said, and then you want me in the Supreme Court. And I didn't want to go to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court would make an order. I was sure I would win there, and I was confident. And the birth, deaths and marriages would comply because of court order. But that wouldn't have set a precedent. That wouldn't have helped anyone else. And I didn't think any adoptee should have to go to the Supreme Court, or any other person that wanted their father's name on the birth certificate. And he convinced me that it's not the way it works, that they'd lost cases in the Administrative Tribunal before, and they were the ones who went to the Supreme Court. So I did that. I went through the Administrative Tribunal, which for all intents and purposes is a court, and I asked that of them, were they a court, and they agreed that they were a court, and their decisions were binding. And I won that case, and it was deemed that the policies and procedures of New South Wales Birth, Deaths and Marriages were wrong. They needed to put my father's name on there, and their rejection of ancestry DNA as evidence was wrong, that it was evidentiary and it needed to be taken into consideration. I've had a number of meetings with the present Registrar of Birth, Deaths and Marriages, and one of those initial meetings I took a number of adoptees with me, and one of them who I'd met in 2018, who was told by the counter staff at Birth, Deaths and Marriages that the only way he would get his father's name on the birth certificate was if he dug him up and got his DNA. And he stopped at that point, like most people that applied. I kept him informed during those 6 years where I was up to, and I took him with me, and he had an application filled out, and I countersigned it, witnessed it, and was slid it across the table to the registrar and submitted it. 6 weeks later, he got an email that he'd been successful, and he asked the worker who'd sent the email, because he'd been with me down to the office of New South Wales Birth, Deaths and Marriages for this meeting, that could he actually get that given to him in person? And she agreed. And he rang me up just after that happened, and he said, after she gave it to him, he said, I know this is probably not the done thing. He said, but can I give you a hug?
Yeah.
And for staff who deal with this to see the result of what this means to people, that's got to have an effect, you know. And with a lot of these things, openings and stuff in Australia, there's a smoking ceremony done by the Aboriginal community to cleanse places and whatnot beforehand. And they said, we're having a smoking ceremony. Now, we haven't got to this point, but I'm also Aboriginal. And I asked the registrar, I said, can I come? I invited myself, and she thought about it for a minute. She said, well, you have to behave. So she arranged for someone to meet me, and I came back later in the afternoon, and she introduced me to all the staff, and I went to the smoking ceremony, and then I spoke to the person doing that smoking ceremony, who was also adopted.
Wow.
And they sent someone out to get me. They said, they're waiting for you to come in for the formal part of the opening. And I was included in the opening speech. I was introduced to everyone. It's a speech by the Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages, but yeah, we're working on it.
Wow.
Wow. Peter, I mean, it's an amazing. And Kendall will correct me, or Kendall will let me know you were able to get your father's name on your birth certificate. So there's,
Yeah,
that's a lot.
Right. It's at 25 now, so yeah, 23. Yeah, absolutely right. Your math's correct. Yeah, 10 years. I'd never done the maths before. I never thought about it.
I still want my corrected or my original birth certificate. I've never seen my original birth certificate. They're hidden, it's sealed, and I have the fake one, which I've always known was fake. And I remember being a small child and pointing at it to my parents and saying, how is this right? You know what I mean?
I don't tell people I'm adopted anymore. Not because, as you know, you say, they go, oh, isn't that wonderful? Did you have a lovely life? No. So I changed the narrative. I say, I found out 8 years ago that I discovered by DNA that I had 2 birth certificates. And they look, what? I said, yeah, they cancelled my original birth certificate and they fabricated a fake one. And they always go, but that's not right. I went,
right.
No, it's not right. It said that I was born to adopted parents. And I said, and they still do it today. And they go, what? They still do it today? I go, that's not right. I said, yep, I know it's right, not right, but yeah, they still do it today. That's the foundation of adoption. You get a completely different response when you start that conversation that way. And I've never had a different response when doing it like that. People just don't know. They don't think about adoption. Like I did. I never thought about adoption. If someone had asked me before I found out, I would, it's a good thing or whatever, I wouldn't have known. It's not until you wear someone else's shoes. And I often say this when I was trying to help my sister. I had empathy for her. But it wasn't until I realised it wasn't her, it was me. I was wearing her shoes. It took on a completely different light. It changes everything. About 3 months after I found out, I overheard my wife discussing blood types with her sister. And a memory flooded back that I had buried for 40 plus years. I was in high school and we were in science and we were asked to bring up parents' blood types in, and they were going to show us how to determine our blood types. And I knew what my blood type was. And I sat there in class and we did the exercise, and I realised straight away my blood type didn't match. So I waited till the whole class left, and I went up to the teacher, the science teacher, and I went, these are my results. They don't add up. And he looked at them and went, well, that's not your father, then you're adopted. Just like that. And I was probably 12-year-old, and I walked out of there, and I don't remember the rest, it's all sort of blurry. But I do. Then another memory came back, and I remembered that I had an argument with the adopted father, and I blurted out, you're not my father, I'm adopted, and then immediately felt guilty and never said that again. And then another memory came back later on that I had asked to see my birth certificate. Obviously, this was playing on my mind. And I had to wait for it. And when I got it, it had their names on it. I remember going, well, the science teacher must be wrong. There it is, it's got their names on it. And I completely buried that. And I believe it's what they call dissociative amnesia. And someone explained to me there was like a beach ball being held under the water. It keeps popping up. And I think they kept popping up through my life, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't realise that story. I completely buried it. I didn't remember it. I wouldn't have built a tree of 13,500 people who've gone to all these reunions had I remembered any of that. So it just shows you how the mind tries to protect itself, from what was. I guess that was, when you look at PTSD event of being separated from your mother, and then these other events being added to it as complex PTSD. That's one of those events.
And to your previous point, I mean, I think it speaks to how much credence we all give to our government to do the right thing. And they aren't. So it's no. Why would you question the fact that you're holding a document that's been governmentally produced?
Well, as children, we're trained to think of a birth certificate as like, this is one of the ultimate pieces of proof, and so it wouldn't even cross your mind that it could be fake, because we're trained to think that, oh, okay, well, we're going to need a copy of your birth certificate to, make sure you are who you say you are. Well,
and that was a central part of my argument to have my father's name in there, that births, deaths and marriages as record keepers, and the judge in the summing up said that I had provided the most up-to-date and accurate information, that they were bound to record it. So
good.
Yeah.
Because conversely, when I was a child and knew that my birth certificate was fake, I would taunt my friends and tease them and say, well, if mine's not right, yours might not be either. You know what I mean? Like it became almost a joke, because that's how much credence I gave it. I'm like, you know what? These idiots, somebody typed this up in some office. They don't know me or my parents.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking back to the 70s. There was a lot of paper licenses that were fake. Mm-hmm. People would type them up in the hotel.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So do you have any idea how many Australians have been able to get their father's name on their birth certificate since you were the first?
I think I don't really know. I've heard, I know personally of 2 or 3. There's probably half a dozen.
That's still a long way to go.
Long way to go, absolutely. What I'm trying to do, and the birth, deaths and marriages have promised me they will do this, that they'll change the forms to enable this. We're still waiting on that. And also waiting on them to update their website to basically advertise the fact that they can't do it. I think they're worried they don't have a large workforce, that this would add some workload to their workforce. So they're a little bit concerned that they get a rush of people. But I come across someone else the other day that weren't adopted, and they were able to get their father's name on their birth certificate. Basically the same situation I was as far as that. Used DNA to prove who the father was, and they accepted that. So I think I helped them. I did try and help someone else, and I got told by the registrar, you should just stick to adoptees. But someone else has done it anyway, so that's great.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
Peter, the final question we've been asking our guests is, when you're on that family twist roller coaster, is there a song or a musical artist that you lean on to kind of help you get through those moments?
No. I never found any. I can't. Teenage years and beyond, I often went to very dark songs, and I don't do that anymore. But I did. I used to go to the Doors, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I discovered AI music, which I know might be controversial, but I've written a number of poems, and I've recently put them to AI.
That's so cool.
I'm really impressed what I got out of it.
No, we are too. For our other podcast, we used AI to create the theme music. Kendall and I sat down together and figured it out, and we were very pleased with the result.
I'm happy to send you some copies or links.
We'd love to. If we could share a full poem or a portion of a poem with the music as part of the episode, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I have a shorter one, which is called Mia Padre, which, of course, is Italian for my father.
Yep.
And it's about the loss of my father.
Wow. That's so cool.
I've actually set that song to two of my Italian cousins.
Oh.
And they both said it brought them to tears. So I think it's in a good way, because my father he brought his family out to Australia, like his extended family. He was the only one who had a car. When they first came out, they all lived with him. And they told me when they went to their father for advice, they go and talk to your uncle. He's the one who knows the answers to that. So, there's another story and a half in that side of that reunion with the Italian side that was very fond of my Italian family.
Oh. Yeah. Do you know whether your father believed you existed?
My mother told me that she had told him. My mother said that she'd known him for about 12 months. They were part of a group that used to go out dances together. So, she told me that she told him whether he believed her or didn't believe her or didn't want to believe her. Who knows, we weren't there. And during my pregnancy, my mother didn't come. My mother worked in Canberra, but it was a long way from where home was. So my mother came from an outback town, northwestern New South Wales, and back in the 1950s, to an Italian immigrant, or probably anyone else, they would have no idea where that was or where to start looking. If he even knew where she came from, I don't know. But her father was dying and her mother insisted that she come home. So my mother was between marriages when I was conceived. She arrived on the doorstep of her parents' place with 2 children and pregnant with me. This goes into intergenerational trauma. My grandmother was part of what we call the stolen generation, where in 1937 the government brought in legislation to remove Aboriginal children, because when Australia was colonised, the English believed that Aboriginal people would naturally die out. And that didn't happen. And they realised that by 1937, that in fact they were getting larger in population. So they thought, well, we've got to stop this. So they brought in legislation to remove children. And they figured out that it would take them 50 years and the Aboriginal problem would be gone. So my mother was taken away, but her father, who was white, I believe fought in court to get them back. So, but the fear of getting taken away was always there. This happened to a lot of Aboriginal people who were removed, that they hid the fact they were Aboriginal. My grandmother's name was Juanita, was able to tell everyone that she was Spanish. And she was very proud that all her children had blue eyes, not brown eyes. When my mother told her my father was Italian, well, that was just one more reason to get rid of me, that she thought I would have brown eyes and that would ruin her.
Right.
Her blue-eyed family.
Oh.
And of course, I have blue eyes. So, yeah, when I found out, because my mother she never told me the story from start to beginning, but she never backed off from me. Whenever I asked her a question, she gave me a straight answer straight away without hesitation. And when I found out she was pregnant with me at a town called Pilliga, I said, and I knew of Pilliga, but I'd never been there. I said, so I've been to Pilliga. And she went, well, yeah. I said, well, I was nearly born in Pilliga. And she said, oh, no, my mother wouldn't have it. she called my brother and bundled me in a car with him and sent me to Sydney to get rid of her, and told me that I wasn't to tell my father. But my mother refused to leave me in the hospital because my mother was a bit older. She wasn't a 15 or 16-year-old, and she just was stubborn and just flat out refused to leave until she was sure I wasn't in an orphanage. So my grandfather questioned, like, where is she? You know, the kids are here, she's not here, what's going on? And she told me that my grandfather never forgave them for me being adopted. And he did die later on, the same year I was born. Yeah, so she got messages from people that she knew in Canberra that my father had been looking for her.
Right.
I think about what would have happened had I been brought up in an Italian household or vice versa in my mother's household. You know, there would have been both, different lives. But
For sure.
Yeah. Wow. What an incredible story.
Yeah.
Keep us up to date on what's going on with legislation and that sort of thing, because...
Well, my next one is adoption discharge. So under legislation in Australia, there was a get-out clause for adopters to hand the child back, and it was called adoption discharge. But under Australian law, the mother, the adoptee, and the adopters are all parties to the adoption. My understanding of US law is the parties are the government and the adopters. But in Australia it's different. As a party to the adoption, I'm entitled to apply for a discharge. But I have to go to the Supreme Court in New South Wales.
Jeez.
I don't believe anyone should have to go to the Supreme Court. And that my argument is that we had no-fault divorce in 1975 for very much the same reasons. And that two people no longer would want to be in a relationship. And why should we have to prove some sort of adversarial fault on one or other party? So I'd like to see no fault discharge. And this basically almost happens in Western Australia, where you send in the application and the judge basically rubber stamps it and grants it. There's no reason not to grant it. So there's no court appearance, but it's different from state to state. Do we have no fault divorce? So that's my next battle in that regard.
Yeah, excellent. We'll keep fighting the good fight. 6 years of pushing, petitioning, proving, and finally, Peter was heard. A name that had been denied to him for decades is now right where it should be, on his birth certificate. On the record, in the story. Peter didn't just reclaim his identity, he rewrote the rules for other adoptees in Australia. His victory set a precedent, and his advocacy continues to open doors for people who have been locked out of their own history. While this is a journey filled with grief, it's also filled with incredible grace. Peter never got to meet his father, but through truth, persistence, and legacy, he made the connection real. To close out this episode, we're honored to share something Peter created from that place of love and loss, a song generated through AI, using his words and intention to express what was never said in life. You're going to hear Mio Padre, My Father. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC. All right, here's Mio Padre, My Father.
My father, my father, my heart bleeds that I never knew you. My father, my father, my heart bleeds that you died before your time. My father, my father, my heart bleeds that you are not here for me. My father, my father, my heart bleeds that you were not in my life. My father, I imagine a world with you in my life. My father, if it could have been, would you like me? Would you have loved me? My father, would you have been proud of me? taught me of my family and culture. My Father, would you have told me of your life's experiences? My Father, your family reveals you. My Father, I revere you. I love the man you were. My Father, I love the stories of you left behind, told to a son you never knew. My Father, thinking of you today, on Father's Day, and every day. You are not in my life. My Father, the mind, and every day.